Hi folks, this is Pastor Sarah with a kids church message for upper elementary kids. This is meant for kids that are 3rd to 5th grade. Our story for the month of November is a story called a parable. And I bet that some of you already know what a parable is. Is that a word that you remember? A parable is a story that Jesus uses to teach people about the way that God works in the world. And sometimes parables are really easy to understand, but other times parables are a little bit more complicated to understand. And today's parable has some parts that make a lot of sense and other parts that are a little bit trickier. We picked the parable that I'm going to tell you especially for November, because it's a parable about a banquet, a big feast. And November is a month when a lot of times we have big feasts. Do you know what I'm thinking of? Thanksgiving, right? But this year, man, everything is so different this year that a lot of our normal Thanksgiving routines aren't going to be happening the way that we're used to them. Like, we can't have our Thanksgiving dinner at church like we usually do. Have you ever been to that when we have all of those long tables set up in the dining room and even on the stage because we have to fit so many people and there's food that everybody has brought and turkeys that have been cooking in the kitchen and we can smell the turkeys all the way through church and it's so exciting because we're going to get to sit down and eat them afterwards. It's really sad that we can't do that this year. And maybe your family's Thanksgiving celebration is going to be different from usual too. There have been so many disappointments this year, haven't there? In some ways, I think that this parable can still speak to us, because this parable also has someone who is disappointed. So that is part of what I want us to focus on in this parable, is the person who feels disappointment. You ready to hear the basic outline of the parable? Okay. So, this parable, this story is about a host, someone who wants to throw a big party, a big banquet. And so they get all the food ready and they get the table all set and they send invitations out to all of their neighbors. But then they start getting responses back, the RSVP notes back from their neighbors. And one neighbor says, "I can't come to your party because I have to work in my field that day." And another neighbor says, "Thank you so much for the invitation, but I really can't come because I have animals, some oxen that I really need to take care of that day." And another neighbor says, "Thank you for this invitation, but I can't come because I just got married and I have to spend that day with my new spouse." And so the host is very disappointed. They made all of these plans and had a wonderful party all ready to go, but now none of the guests are going to come. So the host comes up with a plan. The host tells one of the servants from their household, "Go out into the streets and invite anybody you find." They can be strangers, I don't care, every person you find on the street. Now, in those days, if you just went out into the streets on a normal day, a lot of the people that you would see would be beggars. That is sometimes true in our city too. On some days, a lot of the people that we see out on sidewalks are people who don't have a place to live, or people who do have a place to live but are struggling to pay for their food. And so they're sitting on the corner of an intersection with a cardboard sign asking for help. What are some of the things that you notice about folks in our community who are asking for that kind of help? I notice that sometimes their clothes aren't very clean because maybe they haven't been able to pay for a laundromat to be able to clean them. Or sometimes they're in a wheelchair, right? They have some kind of disability or they have trouble walking. That was true in Jesus' day too. When that servant went out to invite everybody that they found on the streets, some of them were travelers, people who didn't live in that community but were just passing through. Some of them were people who were very poor and their clothes were dirty. Some of them were people who had illnesses or injuries or whose bodies didn't work in the ways that they needed to in order to have a job. And so all of these people got invitations to the party and they came. And the host was very excited that all of these people did come to the party. And as they gathered, the host realized that there was still more room. And so the host sent that servant out and said, invite everybody else that you can find because there is still room at this party. I wonder what this story tells us about God and the way that God works in the world. Do you think that God only invites the neighbors, the ones that are already close to, I don't know, to the church? What is the place where God lives? See, this is where parables can be a little bit tricky. I don't think that God starts by sending out limited numbers of invitations and then sends out more. So it doesn't really work to think about God as the host of this party necessarily. There are also some versions of this story where the host gets angry at one of the guests for not being dressed right. And that doesn't really seem like God either. So, sort of simple ways of looking at the parable that just make the host God might not be the best way for us to read them. I like to look for God in that spark of an idea that the host has. That moment when the host is disappointed and then realizes, wait, there are other people I could invite. There are all these people on the streets. Let's just go invite them. I think that God is that spark that gives the host that idea. That when the host is disappointed by people's responses, instead of sitting there and just pouting because things aren't going their way, that host realizes that there are other possibilities and moves forward with those new possibilities, and an amazing party is the result. That's where I think God is. I think God is those possibilities. That moment when we realize that even though we're disappointed, that doesn't have to be where we stop. That there might be other possibilities just ahead of us that could still result in something beautiful and amazing. I wonder what kinds of disappointments you've dealt with already this year. And I wonder what kind of possibilities have already emerged. Are there things that you have done this year that you wouldn't have done if there wasn't a coronavirus? I've cooked some things that I wouldn't have cooked if there wasn't a coronavirus. I've gone on more walks in the woods than I think I would have if there wasn't a coronavirus. The disappointment doesn't have to be the end. God is always at work in our world, bringing forward new possibilities. And my prayer for you this month is that you and your family and all of your loved ones will see new possibilities, even in times where your disappointment is very big. I love you all, and I hope that you have a great November.